On Thursday, March 21, 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice filed its long-awaited antitrust complaint against Apple. In this video, we will summarize and explain the DOJ's allegations. DOJ filed the complaint in Federal District Court in New Jersey, alongside 16 state attorneys general. The complaint focuses on Apple's iPhone dominance. DOJ says Apple is a monopolist in the market for smartphones more generally, as well as in a narrower submarket for performance smartphones. The overarching theme of the complaint is that Apple has maintained its monopoly position not through competition on the merits, but through a variety of anti-competitive practices. As DOJ puts it, Apple has repeatedly responded to competitive threats by making it harder for users and developers to leave rather than by making it more attractive for them to stay. Apple thus maintained high barriers to switching that effectively locked users into its iOS ecosystem. Not by making iPhone better, but by making it harder and costlier to switch, even if they no longer want their iPhones. DOJ argues that Apple's anti-competitive conduct falls into two categories. First, Apple used its power in the App Store to restrict distribution of certain types of cross-platform apps that might make it easier for users to switch between iOS and Android. Second, Apple used its control over key APIs and other critical access points in the iOS ecosystem to stifle other cross-platform technologies that might facilitate switching. DOJ provided two examples of app categories that threaten Apple's dominance and which Apple limited distribution for. Those app categories are super apps and cloud streaming apps. Super apps are apps that can serve as a platform for smaller, mini programs. They are usually cross-platform, meaning users can get the same experience on iOS and Android devices, which makes switching more attractive. Super apps like WhatsApp are more common in Asia, but Apple imposes restrictions to effectively ban them on iOS in the US. For example, Apple limits apps with mini programs to basic, textual lists of the programs. They cannot use icons or tiles, or categorize their mini programs into app categories, like games or music. Apple also makes it effectively impossible for mini programs within a super app to make money. They cannot use Apple's in-app payment system, nor can they use third-party solutions. These seemingly arbitrary restrictions essentially make super apps unviable. Internal Apple communications suggest that is their explicit purpose. DOJ's second example of Apple impeding app distribution relates to cloud streaming apps. Cloud streaming apps let users run computationally intensive programs like high-quality games from a server in the cloud rather than the program having to run on the phone itself. That means users can access high-quality apps without the need for the most cutting-edge and most expensive hardware. Internal documents show Apple viewed cloud streaming apps as a threat to the value proposition of its expensive iPhones. Apple thus imposed onerous requirements, such as the requirement that it approve any cloud streaming game sold within an app. Apple also required users to download and continuously update individual apps for each cloud streaming game, rather than accessing them all through a centralized app like the Xbox Cloud Gaming app. Finally, Apple imposed its proprietary in-app payment system on cloud streaming games, which means developers have to develop two versions of each game. One for iOS that uses Apple's payment system, and one that runs on all other platforms. After discussing Apple's control over app distribution, DOJ then turned to three examples of how Apple restricts access to key APIs to impede cross-platform technologies. The examples relate to messaging apps, smartwatches, and digital wallets. First, Apple intentionally degraded the experience of messaging between iOS and Android phones. As Apple's internal communications put it, Apple hoped to reinforce obstacles to iPhone families giving their kids Android phones. To do so, Apple prohibits third-party messaging apps from incorporating key functionalities that Apple reserves for itself. DOJ argues that, as a result, Apple makes third-party messaging apps on the iPhone worse relative to Apple Messages. DOJ also argues that by rejecting third-party developers' solutions that would allow for cross-platform messaging encryption, Apple continues to make iPhone users less secure than they otherwise would be. DOJ next alleges that Apple used smartwatches, an expensive smartphone accessory, to deter iPhone users from switching to Android. cross-platform smartwatches can reduce iPhone users' dependence on Apple. So Apple first released Apple Watch, a smartwatch that is only compatible with iPhone. Apple then gave Apple Watch access to critical APIs and degraded the functionality of third-party, cross-platform smartwatches. For example, third-party watches cannot respond to notifications. They also have less reliable connections to the iPhone. And Apple impedes the ability of third-party smartwatches to connect directly with a cellular network. By tightly tying Apple Watch to iPhone, Apple steered users to its smartwatch, which itself was designed to keep users within the iOS ecosystem. Finally, DOJ alleges Apple restricted competing digital wallets. According to internal documents, Apple's hope was that digital wallets, which can contain credit cards, personal IDs, tickets, or car keys, would become something people use every day of their lives. Apple wanted to build its users' dependence on its own Apple Wallet, which is unavailable on Android phones, rather than any cross-platform wallets. To do so, Apple limited competing wallets' access to chipsets on the phone that enable tap-to-pay functionality. Apple further restricts competing wallets from offering the same ability to authenticate digital payment options on online checkout pages, which Apple Wallet offers, and it blocks them from serving as an alternative to Apple's in-app payment system. DOJ alleges that none of the restrictions Apple imposes are technically necessary or justified by some privacy or security consideration. Instead, Apple is sacrificing the quality of its own products because the anti-competitive effects outweigh. In other words, Apple is willing to make its iPhone worse so long as it can do so in a way that makes it harder for users to switch away. DOJ claims that Apple's anti-competitive conduct not only limits competition in the smartphone market, but also reverberates through other industries. These include financial services, fitness, social media, news media, entertainment, automotive, and more. At the end of the day, DOJ is asking the court to enjoin Apple from engaging in the anti-competitive conduct detailed in the complaint. But it also wants the judge to more broadly prohibit Apple from finding new ways to undermine cross-platform technologies. And it is asking for whatever other relief may be necessary to restore competitive conditions to the smartphone and performance smartphone markets. Thank you for watching this summary of the DOJ's antitrust complaint against Apple. This video has been produced by Kressin Meador, an antitrust boutique that specializes in these types of cases. Kressin Meador. Because the right antitrust advocate can be the competitive edge you need.